Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the second of 9 mini-lectures on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Today we're going to talk about the uses of wit. Here's the outline for today, and as I said last time, we'll start by looking at a couple of conversations between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. We concluded our overview of Volume 1 by noticing the symmetry of its design. This balance and symmetry are confirmed when Volume 1 closes the same way it opened, with a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. This conversation tends to confirm the unflattering picture of human love that has dominated the story. Mrs. Bennet, furious that Elizabeth has turned down Mr. Collins, is even more distressed when Charlotte Lucas accepts him. Her feelings are based on property, for Mr. Collins is designated to inherit Mr. Bennet's estate. "Indeed, Mr. Bennet," said she, "it is very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her, and live to see her take my place in it." The problem with this little fantasy is that it assumes Mr. Bennet has died. This prospect does not disturb Mrs. Bennet at all in comparison with the horror of being replaced as mistress of Longbourn. It's typical of her unconscious egotism that she has no inkling that her lack of concern for her husband might offend him, nor any clue that she might be the first to die. It is equally typical of Mr. Bennet's contempt for his wife that he enjoys pointing out both of these things with a sarcasm that goes right over her head. "My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor." Mrs. Bennet continues as if she hadn't heard him. "I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it." What does Mrs. Bennet mean by it? The loss of Mr. Collins as a son-in-law, or the loss of Mr. Bennet when he dies? Mr. Bennet clearly wonders, for he asks his wife, "What should not you mind?" Mrs. Bennet, who either hasn't thought through just what she means, or realizes once put on the spot that what she means is not something she can say out loud, replies lamely, "I should not mind anything at all." To which her husband replies more sarcastically than ever, "Let us be thankful that you are preserved from such a state of insensibility." The word insensibility here means unconsciousness. Mr. Bennet's joke is to pretend that not minding anything at all means being literally comatose. Of course, his deeper, more bitter joke is that Mrs. Bennet is already unconscious of everyone and everything around her, most of all her husband. She has made it perfectly clear that she cares only about his property, and he has made it perfectly clear to us, if not to her, that he sees this and holds her in contempt. Mr. Bennet may be a funny guy, but this is not a pretty picture of the married state. And even though he is obviously more appealing than his wife, we shouldn't let fondness for his wit blind us to his less attractive side. Mrs. Bennet is almost always wrong, but one of the few accurate statements she makes comes in the first chapter when she says to her husband, "You take delight in vexing me." He pretends not to understand his wife, simply to annoy her, and he uses his position as head of household to manipulate the other family members in trivial ways for his own amusement. Ask yourself why, for example, Mr. Bennet should tell his wife in the opening scene that he has no intention of calling on Mr. Bingley. The rules of engagement in his society dictate that until he does so, the other family members may not become acquainted with their new neighbor. When he proposes merely to send his wife and daughters along with a note, as we might do for a child who is late to school, he is already being deliberately absurd, even before he adds that the note will assure Mr. Bingley of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls. Okay, now ask yourself further, why, having denied any intention of calling on Mr. Bingley, Mr. Bennet does so covertly, and then acts as if the rest of the family are being quite unreasonable by not knowing what he has done. That conversation begins in Chapter 2 when he sees Elizabeth trimming a hat and says he hopes Mr. Bingley will like it. Clearly, he wants to provoke a scene, to amuse himself a little further with his wife's frustration before playing his trump card in front of the family. We've seen enough to know that in conversation with his wife, Mr. Bennet combines two advantages: his authority as father and his intelligence. With such advantages, he will always have the upper hand, so why does he need to conceal information and then speak to her as if she knew it? Is it just for fun? When Mrs. Bennet complains that they won't even get to be introduced to Mr. Bingley by a neighbor, Mrs. Long, because she is out of town, he tells his wife that she may introduce Mr. Bingley to Mrs. Long. When she retorts that she can't very well do that when she isn't acquainted with him herself, Mr. Bennet solemnly replies, "I honor your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One can hardly know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight." He's just messing with her. And he keeps it up, laying on the sarcasm pretty thick. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there," he lectures his wife. Then he turns on his middle daughter. "What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books, and make extracts." Of course, what he knows is that Mary tries to be intelligent because she's the one sister among the five who is decidedly not pretty enough. Unfortunately, Mary isn't clever enough either. I think she probably understands, at least on some level, that in her family you either use your intelligence to laugh at others, or you get laughed at for your stupidity. That's the tone Mr. Bennet sets. But since she hasn't got the wit to play this game her father's way, she tries to imitate him in another way, to identify herself with him through books. For it is Mr. Bennet, is it not, who retires to his library at every opportunity and spends as much time as he possibly can reading, though he may not make extracts? The result of Mary's efforts is unfortunate, for she ends up sounding more like Mr. Collins than Mr. Bennet, but you have to feel sorry for her. When her father puts her on the spot by calling for her opinion on forms of introduction, Mary isn't quick on the draw. Her father moves on with a sarcastic glance at her flat-footedness. "While Mary is adjusting her ideas," he continued, "let us return to Mr. Bingley." Then, of course, Mr. Bennet plays his trump card. When his wife, tired of being provoked and toyed with, announces that she is sick of Bingley, he delivers the mock reproach, "Why did you not tell me so before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him." I think the deepest dig comes with that "Why did you not tell me so before?" This is where he's rubbing it in. After all, Mr. Bennet is the one who's derived so much pleasure from withholding information, and now he preempts the very line Mrs. Bennet should be addressing to him in order to use it on her first. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. This sweet domestic scene reaches its climax as Mr. Bennet savors the astonishment of the ladies, but he doesn't care to enjoy it for long. Once he's done needling the family, he leaves the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. And what are those raptures? Only her praise of him, for she is so relieved that he has actually performed his minimal social duty as head of household that she exclaims upon his goodness, and even goes so far as to say, "It is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now." I don't know about you, but by the end of a scene like this one, I have a little more sympathy for Mrs. Bennet's views in the bit of dialogue that closes Volume 1. Why should she mind the loss of a husband whose chief amusement in life is to mock her for being less intelligent than he is? Mr. Bennet is no Shakespearean patriarch. In truth, he exercises very little authority over his wife and daughters. He spends most of his time hiding in the library, and has as little to do with them as possible. When he does exercise his authority, as we see in Chapter 2, he does so in trivial ways, using his wit to keep himself distant from the rest of the family, even when he's in their presence, manipulating them so as to enjoy his sense of superiority. A psychologist would call this behavior passive-aggressive. Mr. Bennet's hostility to his wife and children is never overt. His witty manner masks it as affection ironically expressed. But when he says his younger daughters are two of the silliest girls in England, he isn't being ironic at all. He's telling us and everyone else exactly how he feels, and he feels the same way about his wife, who seems to be on a mental and emotional par with Lydia and Kitty. If you find this way of looking at Mr. Bennet harsh, it's probably because his wit and intelligence really do make him appealing. They are also what link him to his favorite daughter, Lizzie. She's the only one of the five who has learned how to defend herself against her father's wit by imitating it successfully, and her reward is to become his favorite, a preference he makes no effort to conceal from the rest of the family. But Elizabeth had better not imitate her father too well, for Mr. Bennet's wit has not prevented him from failing in the role of patriarchal father. He has failed by either standard, for his marriage has brought him neither love nor property. By the logic of the lineage family, he's failed to provide a male heir, and so opened the door to Mr. Collins. He has equally failed to secure an advantageous alliance in marriage, for Mrs. Bennet's dowry is small, and her connections are, in the language of the novel, inferior, since both her brother and her brother-in-law are in trade. Finally, Mr. Bennet has failed even to establish a companionate marriage based on love. The result is that his wit, which served to prevent none of these paternal failures, serves instead to hold Mr. Bennet aloof from the dysfunctional family he has created but cannot govern, and therefore will only mock. If Elizabeth doesn't somehow escape, not just physically but mentally and emotionally, from this birth family, her prospects for happiness in marriage are not bright. Having offered this harsh judgment of Mr. Bennet, I want to add that I don't think we're wrong to find him amusing. It's part of Jane Austen's strategy, I think, to draw us in at first with his cleverness and superior understanding, so that when we are forced to rethink our first impression of him, there will be a lesson in it for us as well. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the novel's famous opening sentence, and I shall astonish you with the deep mystery of what I call reading backwards, which, in defiance of all common sense, I will argue turns out to be the novel's main theme. Stay tuned.